Papercrafters Library. In this video I'm going to show you how to create this Reach for the Sky card featuring stamps from Lawn Fawn. Now the stamp set that I'm using is this one from Lawn Fawn called Sunny Skies. I'm using the kite, the tail, and then the Reach for the Sky sentiment. So I'm going to start by stamping my kite and the tail onto a piece of Papertrey's Stampers Select white cardstock. And this piece is 3 inches wide by 4 inches high. I'm going to be stamping in my Sukaneko Memento Tuxedo Black ink, which is my favorite ink for coloring with Copic markers. So I'm just inking up my kite, and then I'm going to press and stamp it in the top right corner of my cardstock. Next, I'm going to take the tail of my flag, and you can stamp it in either way depending on which direction that you want the tail to go in. So if you stamp it like this, the tail goes that way. If you stamp it this way, the tail kind of curves more this way. So it's totally up to you how you want to stamp it, but I think I'm going to stamp it like this. There you can see what that looks like. So now we're going to stamp the sentiment Reach for the Sky. Now as you can see, this is a long straight sentiment, but I want it stamped one above the other like this. So there's a couple things you can do. If you feel comfortable doing it, you can cut your stamp. It's not going to hurt your stamp, and then you can always put the two pieces together on your block if you want it going all across. If you're not comfortable with that, then you can mask your stamp. So here I have a piece of tape, and I'm using Scotch Matte removable tape. It doesn't have to be this one, any kind of tape works. And I'm going to start by masking off the half of the sentiment that I don't want to show up. So I'm going to ink this half up first, remove the tape, and then stamp the sentiment. You want to make sure you leave enough room underneath for the bottom part. So Reach for. Now you have to make sure you clean this part of the stamp very well. So I'm going to take my baby wipe and I'm going to wipe that. And then I'm going to just stamp it onto my paper a few times until it's dry and until you see that there's no residue. So now we need to mask off the Reach for portion. So I'm just going to use the same piece of tape. Try not to get my fingers inky. And then I'm going to ink up the sky, remove my tape once again, and then stamp this portion of my sentiment directly beneath the first portion. And there you can see we've now stamped our sentiment on 2 lines instead of on one the way it originally came. My next step now is to color my kite with Copic markers. I'm going to be coloring my kite blue and yellow. So the blue is going to go on these 2 corners and then the yellow on the opposing corners. And for the tail of the kite, I'm going to alternate. Now the blues that I've chosen are BG01, BG05, and BG09. There's 2 main ways of coloring with Copic markers. Coloring from your lightest colors to your darkest, and coloring from your darkest to your lightest. Both ways give you beautiful results. You'll just find one that's more comfortable for you. For me, it's coloring from the dark to the light. I just seem to get much better blending results, and I seem to use less ink. So I'm working with the brush tip. There's a brush and a chisel tip, and I like to uncap all my markers before I start. And I also like to line them up going from the darkest to lightest. Then as I'm working, when I put my dark down, I put it down there, and like that, and like that. And then that way, it's just kind of a system I've developed for myself that works. I hold my marker on an angle, and I use what I call a feathering stroke. So that's simply, you just kind of lightly touch and flick. So when I say I'm feathering, I'm feathering. When I apply my next color, I don't start all the way at the end and color over. I start at the tip, and then I feather just over the tip. So you can see I go over it a little bit. Then with my next color, I do the same thing. I start at the tip and I go over it. And the blending comes as you start to apply multiple layers. So starting with my dark, I'm imagining my light source coming from the top right, meaning that it's going to be the lightest area here and the darkest here. And each individual segment of your image has to be treated like an individual unit. So for each one, you're going to follow the same shading process. So I'm starting with my darkest color. And initially I don't like to apply too much of my darkest color. Can always add more, but once you've applied too much, you can't take away. Other thing is, your first layer is always going to look very streaky. So don't stress about that. Where your blending comes is as you start applying more layers. So there you can see how horrible and streaky that looks. So now we're going to come back with the dark one, and I'm going to bring it up to and extending a little bit beyond my first layer. And then my next one, same thing, extending a little bit beyond the first layer of the middle color I put, and then the lightest color, and pulling that all the way to the end. Now I'm going to go over this again with my lightest color, just starting once again over the mid-tone. You can come back with the darkest color again if you want to, or if you feel like you have enough shadowing, you can simply start with the mid-tone. But you can already see how much nicer the blending is in comparison to when we started with that first layer. Colors always appear a little bit darker when they're wet, so you do want to give it an opportunity to dry. So at that point, I'm just going to leave it like that, let that dry, and then I'll come back and work on it a little bit more. So that exact same process you saw me follow, I'm now going to do on this half of the flag. So my shadowing is going to be along this line, and then my colors are going to move in that way. So I'm going to do that, and I'll be right back. So I finished coloring that side, and I'm now ready to work on this side a little bit more. Now it's shadowed dark enough, so I'm not going to come back with my darkest color anymore. I'm going to start with my BG5. And I'm actually going to start at this point right from the end. So I did go over now the darkest color. And I usually only do that at kind of near the end when I'm doing my finishing layers. As a general rule, as I showed you at the beginning of this coloring section, I don't do that. So there you can see what that looks like, and I think that's probably blended enough. So now, a couple things I wanted to show you. Sometimes when you're coloring straight rather than, let's say, coloring and cutting out, what do you do if you go out of the lines? Here I'm a little bit out of the lines, here I'm a tiny bit out of the lines. Well, that's where you use your Copic blender pen. This is the one that says 0. Use a chisel tip, and you take the tip and essentially you're pushing towards the line. You're not going over the line into the other color. You're going over where your little mistake is, and you're just pushing it towards the line. The blender pen isn't designed for blending color. It kind of moves the color or pushes the color. You can do all sorts of really cool techniques with it. But here, just one of the easiest and neatest things you can do is just correct your mistakes. Now, the darker the color of marker you use, the harder it is. In some colors, it's almost impossible to correct entirely. Like red is really hard. And this dark blue, you can lighten it, but I haven't been able to completely move it. So I'm now ready to move on to my yellows. So for my yellows, I'm going to be using Y00, Y13, and Y17. And I'm following the exact same process that I did with my blues. Y is I find the yellows are a lot easier to blend than the blues are. Whoops, I didn't want my middle, I wanted my darkest. So starting with Y17, Y13, and Y00. then once again coming back with my Y17, Y13, Y00. And then one last time should be sufficient. I'm not pressing too hard, by the way, if you're wondering. You don't want to be seeing your tip bend. So there you can see what that looks like. So I'm now going to go ahead and I'm going to do the same thing with this one. And again, the dark is coming this way and it's moving to light there. So I finished coloring my yellows. Now I'm going to color my tails, and I'm going to alternate between yellow and blue. And it's the same technique. You're just going to find, because the area is a lot smaller, there's really a lot less blending. Same process I'm following, a little bit of the darker, then the medium, then the light. Do that 2 or 3 times until you're happy with how it blends, and then move on. So since it's the same process, I'm not going to sit here and have you watch me do the whole thing. I'm just going to go ahead and finish these, and then we'll be back to finish the rest of the card. So I've finished coloring my kite, the tails of the kite, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to center and stick it to a piece of blue Oasis cardstock from Bazzill that's been cut to 3 1/4 by 4 1/4 inches. I'm going to set that aside for a moment, and I'm going to take my card base. Now this was created out of Bazzill's Tropical cardstock. I cut a 4 1/4 by 11 inch piece of cardstock, scored it at 5 1/2 inches, and then folded it in half to create my card base. Now I'm going to take some of my Mayart's Turquoise Baker's Twine, and I'm going to open up the card front, or open up the card, and then on the inside front of the card, I'm going to stick one end of the twine down. I'm then going to bring it around the center, loop it, this time come below it, loop across the center like this on an angle, so you can see what it looks like at the back. Then I'm going to bring it around this way, once again loop across the center, and then cut it. So I've kept my twine on the roll, and then I'm just going to stick down the other end. Now of course that does look very unsightly, and that's where you take a piece of cardstock and hide it. So here I have a 4 by 5 1/4 inch piece of white cardstock from Paper Tray Ink, Stampers Select, same as what I used for coloring my sentiment. And then I'm going to center this, and I'm going to stick it down, and as you can see, then it hides that. Now if you want to, of course, you can always stick one on the inside too, and I think I will afterwards, just so that it looks finished on both sides. So my last step now is to take my matted image. I'm going to place some foam squares. These are 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch by Thermoweb. I've stuck them to the back, peeling off the backing, and then I'm going to center and stick this onto my card front. Now if you wanted to, you could embellish your kite with a little bit of glitter or a few rhinestones, but if you want to be able to give this to a boy, then I'd probably leave off the rhinestones and glitter. So there you can see what our card looks like, and we're now finished.